very warm welcome, students and listeners. In this episode, we shall begin our discussion with a very important Aristotelian conception of his ideal government. According to Aristotle, the work of a government was to rule, but not just to make rules. The work of the government would be to make such rules which would create such conditions and circumstances which would help the residents or citizens of a city-state to become their best selves, to acquire their highest potentials. Here we get a glimpse of Aristotelian ingenuity, wherein he combines certain elements of oligarchical form of government and certain elements of democratic forms of government so as to evolve a special, his own kind of government, so to say. Here, not one, neither a few would rule, but most people who were considered by Aristotle to be citizens would elect their representatives. A considerable number of people who would be elected, mostly from the middle classes, would rule on behalf of all the citizens. Now, a question which arises over here is, why people only from the middle classes? Because Aristotle believed that those who were ultra-rich had no problems in their lives, and they did not come across scarcities in their lives, and hardly any situation or any law or any policy or any matter of taxation ever dropped a crease on their foreheads. Now, if someone was not aware of what problems majority people in a particular city-state face, they would definitely not be capable of making laws and policies which could make the lives of citizens better. Right? Therefore, the rich were out of the equation. Aristotle further clarified that if the poor people, the poorer section of society, were allowed to enter the gamut of rulers, they would do a bad job of it also. A, they would not have education or training. B, they would be so busy earning their daily breads that they would not have enough time or inclination to understand politics or to participate in politics. Therefore, the two extremes that are found in any society were set aside by Aristotle. What remained was therefore the middle class, a class which had money, enough money to sustain itself reasonably well, also money enough to buy slaves. Slaves are very important in the entire Greek world because it is the slaves who work on behalf of the masters, and working on behalf of the masters ensures that the masters have enough leisure to participate in activities other than mundane work. Middle class people, or rather middle class men, being slave-owning men, being masters of slaves, would therefore have enough leisure or time on their hands to think about politics, to cultivate the various problems of politics, and to come up with solutions to the economic, social, political, maybe even cultural issues that afflicted or affected a particular city-state. Thus, Aristotle's choice of the middle class. The second characteristic of Aristotelian ideal government would be that this government would not be one which was chosen forever or elected forever. Much like present-day democracies, these governments would be periodic in nature. That is, there would have to be elections at regular intervals so as to ensure that the same set of people did not keep on ruling forever and ever and ever. Because staying in power for more than a healthy period of time and knowing that one enjoys an unlimited amount of power for an unlimited amount of time could definitely bring about corruption, according to Aristotle. Therefore, his choice of the middle class, therefore, his decision to bring about a government which would be periodically elected. The third most important element of his ideal government would be the accountability of the ruler to the ruled. Aristotle was perhaps the first to emphasize upon the importance of the consent of the subjects or citizens as the sanction behind sovereign power. And as we know, in today's age of democracy, consensual politics does form the cornerstone of the political world. Aristotle was the first to have highlighted the importance of this particular aspect of political power, that is, the consent of the ruled as the basis of the power of the sovereign. Now, Aristotle's ideas regarding the ideal state brings us to another very important and very interesting Aristotelian notion, which is his notion of the golden mean. Firstly, I must clarify that the word mean over here refers to something like an average, the middle path. Aristotle believed that what is good in moderation is calamity in excess. Too much of anything was definitely not good. Aristotle would much rather prefer a man who was neither extremely brave nor too much of a coward. He would also prefer a person who was moderately wealthy rather than somebody who was extremely rich or filthy rich, as we call it, or in dirty rags. In everything that he saw around him, whether it was nature or it was society, Aristotle found that the people in between, the people who were not part of either extremity, were the ones who were capable of taking up moderate, responsible roles in society, whether in their personal capacities or in their social capacities. It is this idea of Aristotle which is referred to as his idea of the golden mean. He even refers to Western music in this regard. He says that out of the 6 notes that exist in music, the first 2 refer to the lower tones, the last 2 are the highest tones or the higher tones, and it is the 2 notes in between which actually create harmony or music. It is this very example which helps us to understand very clearly why Aristotle prefers the middle path, and therefore his preference for the middle class as the ruling class. With that, we end the discussion on Aristotle's ideal form of government and move into the next question, the very interesting question of citizenship as discussed by Aristotle. Now, who according to Aristotle would make a good citizen? Aristotle believed that unless a person participated himself physically, mentally in the political process of a particular state, he could not be called a citizen. Therefore, children who were mentally not capable of participating in politics could not be called citizens. Women who were considered by Aristotle to be mentally inferior and incapable of understanding politics were not to be considered citizens. Slaves who were either natural slaves or conventional slaves were also considered to be mentally inferior and therefore not considered to be citizens. Extremely rich people who did not bother to participate in politics, who did not have the inclination or the time, because they led such luxurious lives anyway, to participate in politics, they could not be called citizens either. Therefore, it was only those few adult males who were Greek by birth, who belonged to the middle class, who were interested in politics and who actually participated in politics, these men alone could be called citizens according to Aristotle. With that, we come to the next topic of discussion, which is Aristotle's idea about property. According to Aristotle, property was of immense importance in a man's life because it reflected the rewards of a man's efforts, whether mental or physical. Whenever we put in our labor, whether it is our intellectual labor or it is our physical labors or both combined actually, which is mostly the case, we do expect some reward in return. Whatever property we own, whether in terms of money or in terms of movable or immovable assets, these are rewards for the efforts that we have put. In case we do not get these rewards, we shall lose all incentive to work. Aristotle, therefore, laid the liberal foundation for right to property, which would be highlighted and elaborated by John Locke a few centuries down the line. According to Aristotle, property, therefore, was one of the motivations for man to lead a good life, a life full of labor, full of hard work, so that whatever one was entitled to, whatever one deserved, one could acquire. He did not agree with his master Plato in this regard. He did not believe in the Platonic line that property leads to corruption, it leads to selfishness, it leads to misuse or abuse of power. He believed that the main aim of any just society, of any just state, would be the just distribution of rewards. Now this brings us to the other very important Aristotelian conception, which is of justice. Aristotle discusses justice from the perspective of distributive justice. He makes it clear that he wants equals to be treated equally and unequals to be treated unequally. That is what distributive justice is all about. A person having more merit should be given more rewards, whereas a person who is either not meritorious or not naturally endowed with intellectual, physical, or imagination capabilities was bound to achieve less in life. That was not unjust according to Aristotle. As far as a man worked and got what he deserved, he believed the system to be just. This laid the foundations of what has been later on developed as distributive justice. Next, we come to what Aristotle says about slaves and women. Now, why I mention slaves and women at the same time is because the conception that Aristotle gives is not a very flattering one, and he believes that both slaves and women are intellectually and physically incapable or inferior, rather, to men. Men he considers to be superior physically, mentally, and intellectually as well. Women were born or had the function of fulfilling the life of a man within the household. That was just about the function that she was capable of performing. Looking after the household, satiating the physical desires of a man, and giving birth to children, looking after children were all the functions that Plato could think of as women capable of performing. As far as the slaves are concerned, Plato gives the example of sheep. He says that just like sheep and goats would not be safe unless they were shepherded, they would maybe lose their paths and they might even end up losing their lives. Similarly, slaves or natural slaves were born intellectually and physically inferior to the rest of the men. Therefore, they could only survive and they could be happy and they could lead their lives only if they followed their masters. Thus, women and slaves together as the inferior partners of man would help man in completing his family, becoming a satisfied man, helping him to fulfill all his material, physical, emotional, psychological needs, and then make him capable of moving out of the house and participating in the political, social, economic sphere. With that, we come to the most interesting, outstanding, and unique contribution of Aristotle. He was once again the first person to discuss about revolutions, to inquire into the various causes of revolution, and he also suggested certain remedies, certain means by which revolutions could be overcome. Now, first and foremost, the cause that has been identified by Aristotle as being one of the main reasons for revolutions are the various psychological motives behind people who are revolting. These motives might have been the search or the lust for more power, for money, for fame, for other egotistical ends. It could be simple matter of greed. It could be some familial disagreements, some internal rivalries. These are the various reasons which Aristotle identifies as the psychological motives behind revolutions. The second cause of revolution, as identified by Aristotle, involved the objectives of the mind. Rather, these were certain causes which could only be found in the minds of men. They were more effective or active at the level of individuals and not active at the level of the society. As in, there were bound to be certain people in all kingdoms or in all states who were themselves individually motivated and singularly motivated towards the achievement of power. They were not much bothered as to whether the king or the ruler that they wanted to unseat was a good one or a bad one. It was simply a case of personal ambition and lust for power. It might even include the intense desire to acquire all the benefits, privileges, and equality of status, social respect, as was given to the king or the rulers. The third category of causes, as identified by Aristotle, were the economic and political conditions. Now, these are conditions which are very easy for us to understand or to comprehend, because whenever a ruler would fail to ensure at least equitable distribution of wealth, of resources in a society, economic and political equality or parity was bound to be disturbed in a particular state. And that would lead to dissatisfaction amongst the masses. Inevitably, a path would be paved for revolution or rebellion. Now, Aristotle did not just stop at identifying the causes of revolution. He even went ahead to sort of deliver these causes and find out what the remedies to these particular causes of revolution could be, because we have to keep in mind that his entire political philosophy is actually motivated towards identifying the ideal state, and not just finding out the ideal state or philosophically constructing the ideal state, but also to ensure that the ideal state could remain, could be maintained. Okay, that there was stability. Now, in case a revolution happened, the stability of this ideal state would have been hampered, would have been endangered. Therefore, Aristotle does not only identify causes of revolution, but he also identifies how, or rather tells the rulers of various states how they could avoid revolution. The most common and the general solution that Aristotle gives to this problem is to maintain justice in society, to give each person proportionate rewards. Each person, when he gets what he truly deserves as per his labor, as per his merit, as per the work that he has put into a particular process, that would create satisfaction with the system. This satisfaction would give rise to what is known today as political obligation. If I have no complaints against my state, I would obviously remain obedient to my state. I would follow the laws and policies that are framed by my state, and I would remain loyal to it to the end, and therefore I would help to maintain the stability of my political system. Whenever a king has ignored his duty of being just towards his subjects, he has always given rise to the scope to create revolution. Sooner or later, he has ended up being either killed or unseated from power. Now, this is Aristotle's special contribution to political philosophy in the sense that prior to him, his teacher Plato, neither Socrates, none of them, though all of them were faced with the problems of rebellions, revolts, and revolutions, none of them had gone to the extent of systematically analyzing, understanding, and trying to give solutions to avoid revolutions or to deal with this menace of revolutions. It was Aristotle alone who spoke about the causes as well as the remedies of revolutions, of trying to avoid revolutions and maintaining political stability. Now, having touched upon the most important aspects that Aristotle has dealt with in his works, in his political works. So he has works which span an entire gamut of subjects, but having dealt with the major themes that we find in the politics and Nicomachean ethics, we see that Aristotle, perhaps the most famous disciple of Plato, was himself not a Platonist. He differed with his master, he critiqued his master, and we can even say that while Plato was an idealist and a radical, Aristotle was a realist and a conservative. This can be stated very categorically when we look into his conception or his ideas regarding the family. Where Plato disregards filial relations, interpersonal relations, relation of man to his labor, relation of man to his property, Aristotle strongly bases his state upon the foundation of family, upon the relationships between a man and a woman, relationship between a man with his child, relationship between a master and a slave. Upon these three relations, he has based his family. This family has slowly aggregated together to form villages, and many villages together had formed the state. He made the state an extension of man himself, therefore a natural institution and not a man-made institution or a divine institution. And having made the state a natural institution, he made it a rational institution too. He spoke about justice. He spoke about giving each man his due. He spoke about equality of equals, whereas inequality of unequals, which is actually the greater part of justice. He did not do away with any of the basic human emotions of love, of possession, of possessiveness, of possessive love, as Plato had done earlier. We realized with Plato that the philosopher kings were ultimately dehumanized men and women who were given the huge task of ruling over a society based only upon their capital of knowledge. No love, no personal relationships, no success, no failure, because they did not possess anything to lose, or neither did they gain anything. Aristotle, on the other hand, was much of a realist. He realized that politics concerns real men and women and very real problems or demands that these real people had or faced from day to day. In order to solve those problems, it would be necessary to have representatives who would be real themselves, who would be human themselves. And he also emphasized upon the importance of periodic government, much unlike Plato. Plato was bent upon selecting a philosopher king or queen through a very, very difficult and rigorous process of selection. But once into the category of being a philosopher king or queen, a person could remain in that particular post till the end of his days. Aristotle does no such thing. He does not put too much currency on knowledge or capability or wisdom or nothing at all. For him, the only qualification for becoming a citizen or becoming a ruler is that one plays an active role. And this is very, very important. One plays an active role in the day-to-day politics, in the day-to-day administration of a particular city-state. Perhaps he was also the first man to ever emphasize upon the fact that one has to perform duties before seeking rights. Therefore, with Aristotle, we find an ideal state and an ideal government which is more realistic and which is more practicable. Aristotle, because of his varied interests and his wide range of knowledge and research, writings and lecture, is often therefore referred to as an intellectual colossus. Undoubtedly an intellectual giant, an individual who has contributed so much to the entire gamut of learning that no man before him, during his time, or after him has till date contributed single-handedly as much to as many subjects of knowledge as he had done at that particular point of time. Undoubtedly, we have every right, we have every occasion and every justification, therefore, to refer to him as the father of political science, because he made the obscure political philosophy that Plato and before him Socrates and during Plato's times the various other schools of Greek political thought had brought into political philosophy. Aristotle took away the philosophical overbearings of the Platonic times and infused a sense of the scientific temperament, which made the study of politics, political systems, and the state a more scientific and a more practicable endeavor. With that, we end our very brief discussion on Aristotle. Thank you.